and welcome to Politics Today, Home Edition. And in this programme today, we will be discussing what the political world's going to look like post-Covid-19. And this programme today, I'll be joined by Robin Benson, who is a Christian political analyst, as well as Sid Caudle, who is leader of the Christian People's Alliance. So, gentlemen, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
And Sid, it must be very difficult being a leader of the Christian People's Alliance during lockdown. How have you managed during this whole crisis with the global pandemic known as COVID-19?
Well, it's all gone very well for me, but I suppose you'd like me to let you into my secrets. Well, normally I travel around the country visiting a lot of meetings and spend a lot of time on trains, etc. And in the meetings, I normally invite people to express an interest in the Christian People's Alliance. I've got some forms with me, and as they fill this form in to keep in touch, and on that basis we make new contacts. During lockdown, I've not been attending any meetings at all, but I have been on a lot of Zoom meetings. Marriage, Sex and Culture, for a start, which is very interesting. That's every Saturday. We've been on that one. We have our own CPA prayer every Monday, which will be on today at 7 p.m. And that's been growing with more and more people being involved. I've been involved in lots of other different groups. You don't want me to tell you all of them. Now, what I've done is, as I've been on these groups, you've got names in the bottom corner of Zoom, as I have here. And I look at that name, and then I put that name into a search on Facebook, and then I ask if I can be friends with that person. And on that basis, I've made loads of new Facebook friends, and I've invited them all to join the Christian People's Alliance. And then as I've done that, Facebook have suggested lots more friends for me. So I keep finding new people living in the UK that are Christians and invite them to join the Christian People's Alliance. And we're doing very well. We've got new members, lots of new people involved, and it's much cheaper. I'm not having to pay train fares. I'm not having to pay loads of petrol. So I'm happy.
Very good, very good. I prefer real friends myself. But in terms of Zoom, I'm not a great fan of doing this. I'm much happier in the studio. I prefer the kind of natural form of communication. But this has meant that it has opened up the world for the Late Show and Politics Today that I've been doing. Robin, now it looks like, well, England in particular is coming out of COVID-19. This is creating so much more problems for the government as because of the heat wave that we had last week. We saw a mass of people going to beaches in like Bournemouth. We're having drinking parties and rave parties, which is again causing more problems. How do you think that the government can now handle the end of this crisis unless we face another second wave either in the autumn or the winter this year?
Well, I think you sort of raised that issue at the end of your question, and looking at the headlines over the last 2 or 3 days, that seems to be something that members of this SAGE group of advisors to the government have been highlighting. People outside the group have been highlighting it, but it's always couched in terms of could or maybe, this might happen, that might happen. And again, it boils down to the fact that they don't really know what's going to happen. In the meantime, as you've highlighted, we live with the frustrations that are boiling over and people deciding they're going to do what they want to do, no matter what. And as you highlighted, the folk on the beach at Bournemouth, there were other incidents elsewhere. And it's probably, I would suspect, creating multiple headaches right across the departments in government that are having to deal with this, because they are scared stiff of a further wave coming. And they see the behavior of folk who've gathered en masse as irresponsible. Whether it is or isn't, time will tell. But it is certainly creating much heartache and probably a lot of frustration in various government departments. And ministers have tried to address it, asking people to behave themselves. But I honestly wonder if, because folk have been cooped up, 3-4 months, whether they're going to take a blind bit of notice, because they've seen other people, including senior members of the government and advisors, breaking their own rules And, it's the human reaction. Well, if he can get away with it or she can get away with it and nothing happens to them, I'm not going to take any notice of these rules and I'm going to do what I want to do.
And Sid, I want to bring you in this one. What is your assessment of the government's handling of the COVID-19 crisis, particularly our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who wanted to be known as the first post-EU Prime Minister, but now it looks like he's going to be the first post-COVID-19 Prime Minister instead?
Well, I think it's been very difficult because at the beginning of the crisis, a lot of people really didn't know what we were dealing with, how serious it was, whether lockdown was a complete overreaction or highly necessary. I think a big mistake, in my view, was made by telling people at the beginning that you didn't need to bother about face masks, it wouldn't make any difference. I mean, that was clearly government advice. It doesn't make the slightest bit of difference whether you have a face mask on or not. Now they're telling people you must wear a face mask. It's compulsory on all public transport and is very necessary in order to contain the virus. So we were clearly given wrong advice on that issue. The effectiveness of ventilators has been shown to be pretty awful. I believe more than 80% of people that have been on ventilators have ended up dead. So they've clearly not worked, where at the beginning of the process, people was basically told, oh, we just need ventilators. We've got enough ventilators, we'll be fine. Well, that's not worked. There's various treatments they've looked at. I believe they're increasingly finding treatments that are working. But the truth is, I mean, the figures I look at are deaths per million population. And if you look at those figures, Belgium is clearly the highest in the world, which of course they don't want to talk about, but that's the truth. And the UK is second. So the number of deaths per million has been pretty awful. So that's also a major concern. We can't, I'm afraid, look at what's happened in the UK and say, oh, we've done well. We haven't done well at all.
And Robin, as of this recording of this programme today, tomorrow, Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, launches what he's describing as his New Deal that was based on President Roosevelt's plan to build big building projects that would essentially got America out of the Depression in the 1930s, really using kind of Keynesian economics rather than what we see as the free market economics. What do you make of Boris Johnson's big spending plans, such as investing billions in new schools, building new infrastructure and new hospitals, as well as transport infrastructure as well, for his great New Deal in the post-COVID-19 world?
Well, as you and I know, Simon, this was heralded and trumpeted across most of the Sunday papers yesterday morning. And they sort of continued on through the coverage that various media sources have given to it today, all in expectation of whatever Boris is going to say at some point tomorrow when he makes the speech. I mean, the question, I don't know about Sid, but the question for me that immediately came to mind is, where on earth is all this tens of billions of pounds going to come from? I mean, our own economy as it stands is on its knees. If not worse. I mean, it probably is nearly horizontal in some sectors, dead. So where is the money going to come from to pump into all of these projects? And many of the projects, I mean, they sound great. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not pouring cold water on it as such. But many of the projects are, as you point out, infrastructure projects. But a lot of the people who've lost jobs are not trained. Brickies or plumbers or plasters or electricians, or even just are not trained for manual labor. A lot of it is manual labor related, which is great. But it's not going to meet the needs of those who have lost jobs in service industries, in hotel and catering and tourism, unless they're literally prepared to completely change direction in their lives and do something completely different. Some will be prepared to do that, others will not, because they've invested, the early part of their lives to train themselves up to do what they're currently doing and the job that they've lost. So I think it's like many of the things that have happened, Sid has already highlighted it in his comments so far. It raises sometimes more questions than it gives answers. And it seems to me that, again, a lot of what has been launched on this is confusing, it's nebulous, it's not nailed down, it's generalities. And that's the way it's been throughout the last 3-4 months. Generalizations that in some people's lives cause more confusion than clarity.
And Sid, Boris Johnson's plan for a big building project known as the New Deal that he's going to launch tomorrow is, I would say, a very kind of worrying departure from previous Conservative policy, which we know that David Cameron balanced the books after the banking crisis with policies of austerity and cutting public spending. And considering that this COVID-19 crisis would have cost the government maybe even hundreds of billions of pounds. And we're looking at the highest unemployment rate since the early 1980s, and our economy is on the verge of recession / depression. Do you think that Boris Johnson adopting kind of Keynesian economics rather than supply and demand politics, economics that was developed by Margaret Thatcher, is the way out of this crisis?
Yes, in a word. But I don't know whether you've read the Christian People's Alliance manifesto. You should have done. If you had, then you would appreciate that we've said many times that the right approach is to maintain and increase capital spending while controlling revenue spending and maybe even reducing revenue spending. That's what we did in 2010 when we were presented with this enormous deficit of running at 172, increasing by 172 billion per year, which the Labour Party left us with. What the government did was they didn't cut capital spending at all. They maintained it and increased it. Now, the only reservation I have is whether we're spending enough on productive investment. Now, at the moment, we're still bound by EU rules as to what we can give to industry. But when we leave the European Union, we're told properly at the end of December, Boris Johnson has said he's not going to be bound by any of these rules. So that means that we can give support to our industry. Now, I don't think we should be giving subsidies, and I don't think we should be trying to run industry ourselves. But I do think we should be giving very cheap loans, possibly 0% loans, so that we can rebuild steel industry, rebuild shipbuilding industry, rebuilding car industry, whatever industries we need to rebuild, and also fishing as well. I mean, at the moment, we take about 30% of the fish stocks from our fishing waters. We've said we're going to ban EU boats that take the rest. So we're going to be able to control our fishing waters. So we're going to need new fishing boats to do the fishing. So right across the board, we need to see the opportunities, invest in productive industry, not only in hospitals and schools. And that is what's going to create wealth. And in the long term, that will produce the revenue and bring us back to a balanced budget. That is the right approach.
But Robin, wouldn't you say that our economy has moved on so much from the 80s and 90s? Now we live in a global village. Everything is high tech. And if we look at Israel's economy, for example, it's all about startup nation. It's all about innovation. It's all about designing apps for the digital world. And Israel's one of the leading nations in this. Shouldn't this be the direction that our government should go in rather than investing in big infrastructure projects? And let's start building high-tech infrastructure projects in terms of capital investment?
I'm not sure, Simon. I think probably we need a balance of both. I mean, we are in desperate need. I mean, you probably read one of the articles today that some of the, the senior heads of the educational movement have said that the 1.6 billion that the government wants to throw at schools actually is about a quarter of what actually is needed in order to bring schools up to a proper standard. So I think we got to be careful not to do one thing to the exclusion of the other. But yes, I agree. We have men and women, young people in this nation who could just as easily be tech entrepreneurs and tech giants as they are in Israel or anywhere else. They just need the investment and the opportunities to take those things forward. But we can't do without the infrastructure. We certainly can't do without housing, which has been a major issue, this government, previous governments going back decades. So I think it's balance in all of these things, but not going overboard in the physical stuff to the detriment of what needs to be done on the technical side as well.
And Sid, moving on now, what is your assessment of the new leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer? Because according to recent opinion polls, more people approve Keir Starmer than they do our current Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and many people have said that he handled the Rebecca Long Bailey crisis extremely well by sacking her because she retweeted a tweet that suggested that it was the Israeli Defense Force that trained the US police force that had that black American killed by the police officer, and that Israel was to blame, which thankfully and rightfully so that she was sacked, as the New Labour said he would not tolerate any form of anti-Semitism within his party, which is a complete departure from his predecessor.
Yeah. Keir Starmer's got a very strong image. He's got the advantage, of course, that he's got the media on his side, and he's infinitely better than Jeremy Corbyn, particularly on Israel, as you're saying. But we must never forget that Keir Starmer is totally in favour of the European Union. In fact, he would have been taking a much stronger line at the last election in favour of the European Union. He was strongly in favour of a second referendum and wants us to stay in the European Union come what may. So exactly how that will pan out if he's leader, I don't know, but we have to be aware of that. He's totally committed to the whole new age liberal agenda, which includes relationship and sex education in schools and so on and so forth. So he's completely committed to that agenda. So I'm afraid you can't look at Keir Starmer and say, here is somebody who is basically a conservative. I'm sorry, no. He's very much a socialist, but he's a socialist who's with a far more responsible image than Jeremy Corbyn.
Can I just come in on that one, Simon? Because there's also two other factors here. The time that he's sacked Rebecca Long Bailey, fine, no question. His foreign affairs spokesperson, Lisa Nandy, again yesterday came out saying that if Israel extends sovereignty into Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley, that Israel should be sanctioned by the EU and the UK for doing so. Plus the fact, Keir Starmer was one of Jeremy Corbyn's senior cabinet, shadow cabinet colleagues while all of this was going on under Jeremy Corbyn's watch, and he did nothing to stop the anti-Semitism, the rot of anti-Semitism that pervaded and still pervades some elements of the Labour Party. So fine, good for him what he did with that particular cabinet member, but he has still some questions to answer to, which will never be asked of him now, because he's, as Sid has pointed out, he's the glamour boy of the British media, and they'll quietly forget about those aspects and push him forward as an alternative to Boris.
Sid, I want to bring up an issue which is very important, and this is something we've definitely noticed since the beginning of lockdown because of the global crisis, COVID-19, and that is the rise of lawlessness that we've seen on our streets, the rise of violence, and now how our own police force are scared because our police are being targeted. How do we rebuild? How does a government rebuild our society after this COVID-19 crisis and deal with the growing sense of lawlessness that we're seeing across the Western world right now?
Yes, you've highlighted a very, very interesting point there. I mean, I'm afraid a substantial amount of this is spiritual, and it's something that our listeners should certainly be praying about, because it's almost as though it is a spirit of rebellion that has hit parts of society. And when we've been praying about this, we've certainly been praying against the whole spirit of rebellion. But from a practical point of view, the police have certainly got to do more work to try and get alongside the black community and to work with the black community, with community leaders to seek to create understanding and create trust, without, of course, being frightened of dealing with crime. I mean, there's evidence to show that they were frightened to deal with the groups that were involved in sex trafficking and such like, because the people doing it were coloured, therefore that they didn't want to get involved and they stood back, and that's dangerous. We can't allow that. But where you've got responsible community leaders that can talk to the police, and that needs to be done. And also, I believe what's very important is that we do deal effectively with supporting people when they come out of prison. At the moment, the reoffending rate is far too high, over 30%. And where Saltbox in Stoke and Message Trust in Manchester have actually worked with offenders and given them help and support, they've got it in their areas down below 10%. And we need to be looking at that nationwide. So the police are working with prisoners so that, and helping, or the society is working with prisoners, helping them and supporting them, so we have less crime. That's the approach, I think.
Just to pick up on the point that Sid made about the spiritual aspect of this, there's a principle that God laid out that the Apostle Paul spells out in the first chapter of his letter to the Romans. It's in a specific situation, but there's a biblical principle behind that there comes a point when a society gets into such a state of rebellion against God that he gives them over to it. In other words, he removes his hand of protection, the hand that keeps things at bay, as it were, and allows the society literally to run riot. And I don't know where Sid stands on this, but I think we've reached that point in our society. I'm not saying there's no hope. There's always hope. But we have to examine ourselves as believers in Jesus and as a body of believers in this nation to see, are we part of the problem? And has God unleashed this or removed his staying hand and allowed our society to head into this anarchic and rebellious state? And if that's the case, then we are in deep trouble, really deep trouble as a society.
And Sid, as Christians, how do we prepare ourselves to live in this new post-COVID-19 world where we're seeing that it's a very, very different world than the one we left back in January of 2020. And we're seeing more globalization. We're seeing the prospect of a very, very left-wing president emerge on the world scene. And our nations and our societies are collapsing at the present time, which is creating not only a spiritual vacuum, but also a political vacuum as well.
You paint quite a miserable picture. Actually, I believe that there's a lot of good things going on as well, particularly within the church. And I think in the post-COVID-19 world, there's going to be a lot more prayer going on Zoom, as there has been during the lockdown. And that's only to be encouraged. I mean, even just this week, we've been doing some prayer with somebody from South Africa on Zoom who said, look, I want to pray with you. I want to pray with you. We've had our own meetings, and we've had people locking in from India, from United States, from South Africa, from Australia, and suddenly we're all praying together and we're sharing things which we weren't doing at all before the lockdown. And also just meetings. I mean, at our last Christian People's Alliance council meeting, we normally get about 11 or 12 people. We had over 30 people. People coming in from Scotland and Wales and Manchester and Leeds and all sorts of areas who don't normally travel down to London to the meetings. So there's been a lot of good things going on. And on an international basis, I think we've got to be aware of the agendas. Certainly, this whole thing of trying to create a one world government is there. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, interestingly, have been at the forefront of this and basically saying, yes, we want a one world government. And that's something I think which from a Christian perspective is very dangerous. It's something we don't want. And what we want is to strengthen the nation state, absolutely.
And Robin, we're about 2.5 minutes to the end of the programme. So as Christians, how do you think we should all respond? And how should we pray, particularly in light of the new circumstances that we find ourselves in, as it looks like we are gradually moving out of the COVID-19 global pandemic?
Well, I mean, Paul, again, in his letter to Timothy, encourages believers to pray for the government. So we need to continue to pray for Boris Johnson and his cabinet, that God will give them wisdom in how to best deal with this, how to lead the nation out of this. But we need to pray too for the body of Christ in this nation, that we sense what God is saying to us in the midst of this crisis, and be prepared maybe to change the way that we do things in order to walk in obedience to him at this time.
And Sid, as Christians, how should we be praying for our government and our members of parliament, our police force, and our own armed forces as well, post-COVID-19?
Well, the word that comes to mind is wisdom, because they're going to need wisdom, and absolutely, and to a certain extent humility as well, because we need to recognize the importance of seeking the will of God, frankly. And with God, there is perfect wisdom. And if as a nation we turn back and start seeking the will of God, then we'll go down the right path. If we turn our back on God, then we're going to be in a mess.
Yeah,
absolutely. Robin, do you want a final word for 30 seconds? How important is it that as Christians we don't only pray for our government and our Prime Minister, but also get actively involved and be the salt in our society to make Jesus known and to make the gospel known, and to realize that our nation needs God more than needs anything else at this moment in time?
Well, I mean, as Sid has pointed out, and I've heard other believers say that there have been fantastic opportunities to talk about the Lord Jesus that have arisen through this crisis, whether it's on Zoom, Facebook, streaming, whatever, or just one-to-one as you bump into people. So we need to be prepared to take those opportunities as they come along.
Robin and Sid, I just want to thank you so much for joining me on the home edition of Politics Today, and I want to thank you all for watching this program. There can be no doubt that we are entering into new uncharted territory as we come out of the COVID-19 crisis. The world is not going to be the same, so therefore it's important as Christians that we stand on truth, and that we stand on the word of God, and we stand in our own faith that the only answer for the nations is Yeshua HaMashiach himself, and we need to pray that our government will turn to God for help. Then maybe we'll see a restoration in our nation's fortunes and that of the Western world. So I want to thank you guys for watching Politics Today.